Picture yourself standing at the edge of the great Nile River, the air thick with heat and the smell of ancient mud. The water is murky, alive with unseen things. And somewhere along that riverbank, someone, a woman, perhaps elegantly dressed, perhaps already thinking about tomorrow's beauty routine, is collecting something unthinkable. Crocodile dung. Yes, you read that correctly. In ancient Rome, women used crocodile excrement as a cosmetic treatment, specifically as a face mask and skin-softening agent. It sounds like something from a fever dream, but to Roman women, this was simply part of the pursuit of beauty, and beauty, in Rome, was serious business. Now, why would anyone think this was a good idea? Here is where it gets fascinating. Roman physicians and beauty writers, including the famous Galen, catalogued all manner of animal-derived substances for cosmetic use. Crocodile dung was believed to have skin-lightening and smoothing properties, and pale, flawless skin was the ultimate Roman beauty ideal, a sign of wealth, femininity, and social status. Women who could afford such exotic ingredients wore their pale skin like a crown. Think of it this way. Today, we spread charcoal on our faces without blinking. We pay small fortunes for snail slime serums and bee venom creams. Every generation draws its beauty rituals from the world around it, believing deeply that the stranger the ingredient, the more powerful the result. And so Roman women, practical, resourceful, deeply human, reached for what their world offered, even when what their world offered was, well, this. The aha moment here is quiet but profound. The desire to feel beautiful is one of the oldest, most universal human impulses. Only the ingredients change. The longing never does. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the roar of the Colosseum. Tens of thousands of Romans on their feet, the sand below stained and hot, and at the centre of it all, two figures, muscles gleaming, locked in a kind of brutal, breathtaking dance. Now imagine one of those figures walking off the arena floor, skin drenched in sweat and oil, and a Roman woman waiting, not with horror, but with a small, elegant jar. Because that sweat, that was going straight onto her skin. Gladiator sweat, collected by scraping the body with a curved metal tool called a strigil, was bottled and sold as a luxury beauty product. Roman women rubbed it into their faces as a moisturizer and perhaps more intriguingly as an aphrodisiac. The product even had a name. It was sometimes called gloios, and it was not cheap. Why gladiators specifically? Here is the logic, and it is surprisingly coherent once you step inside the Roman worldview. Gladiators were considered the pinnacle of physical perfection. They were carefully trained, well fed by the standards of the time, and their bodies were treated as valuable instruments. Their sweat, mixed with the olive oil they trained in, was thought to carry some of that vitality, that almost supernatural masculine energy, directly into the skin. Think of it like today's obsession with celebrity-endorsed skincare. We buy creams because a beloved face tells us it works. Romans simply cut out the marketing and went straight to the source. There is something beautifully strange here. In a society that kept rigid walls between gladiators and respectable women, beauty rituals quietly dissolved those walls, one small jar at a time. Power and desire have always found each other, no matter the century. Settle into this one gently, because it is equal parts chilling and deeply, uncomfortably human. Imagine living in a world where you have no vote, no political voice, no guaranteed right to your own children. Imagine that your husband can divorce you on a whim, take everything, and leave you with nothing. Now imagine that one day, someone whispers to you that there is a way to shift the balance. A quiet way, an untraceable way. In ancient Rome, women were formally accused, and in some cases convicted, of poisoning their husbands. This was not a rare whisper or isolated scandal. It was widespread enough that in 140 AD, a tribunal was formed specifically to investigate what Roman authorities described as an epidemic of wife-administered poisonings. According to the historian Livy, the investigations led to the deaths of hundreds of women found guilty of the crime. Now, historians debate how much of this was real and how much was male anxiety projected onto women, because poison in the ancient world was the weapon attributed to those without physical power. It was called the coward's weapon, the woman's weapon, which tells you everything about how Roman society understood gender and force. But here is the philosophical thread worth pulling. When a society strips a group of people of legal recourse, of voice, of exit, it should not be surprised when they find other exits. Desperation is extraordinarily creative. Some of these women were undoubtedly guilty. Others were almost certainly scapegoats. The truth lives somewhere between the two, as it so often does. What lingers is not the poison. It is the question underneath it. What choices were these women left with? And who decided they deserved so few? Take a slow breath and step into this one imaginatively. Picture a grand Roman household at dawn, marble floors still cool from the night. A woman sits before a polished metal mirror, her attendant moving quietly behind her, and on her face, carefully applied and left to dry, is something dark and rich and deeply unsettling to modern eyes. Blood. Specifically, the blood of gladiators. Gladiatorial blood was considered among the most potent substances a Roman woman could apply to her skin. It was used as a treatment for epilepsy when drunk, yes, but it was also applied topically as a restorative face treatment, believed to transfer the fighter's vitality and strength directly into the complexion. Now, pause here. Why blood? Why gladiator blood specifically? In Roman cosmological thinking, blood was life itself. It carried the essence of a person, their energy, their strength, their very spirit. And gladiators, as we have already seen with their sweat, occupied a peculiar place in Roman imagination. They were socially degraded, but physically glorified. Their bodies were simultaneously objects of fascination and revulsion, and that tension made their blood feel almost mythological. There is a parallel here that is worth sitting with. Think about how modern beauty culture fetishizes the extraordinary, the rarest plant extract, the most remote mountain spring water, the most expensive gold-flecked serum. The logic is identical. Rarity plus power equals transformation. Roman women were not irrational. They were operating within the belief systems of their world, reaching for what that world told them was powerful. And perhaps that is the most grounding thought of all. Every era has its blood mask, metaphorically speaking. We all, in our own way, seek transformation through the extraordinary. The form changes. The hope does not. Here is a sentence that will take your brain a moment to process. Ancient Roman women rinsed their mouths and teeth with urine. And not just any urine. Portuguese urine specifically was considered the most effective, aged and imported at considerable expense, because the longer urine sits, the higher its concentration of ammonia. And ammonia, as it turns out, is genuinely effective at whitening teeth. Let that settle. Now, before your modern sensibilities fully revolt, consider this. You have almost certainly used ammonia-based products today. They are in your household cleaners. They are in some hair dyes. The chemistry here is not wrong. The Romans stumbled onto something real through centuries of observation, even if the delivery method makes us wince. The practice was well documented. The poet Catullus even mocked a man named Egnetius for his blindingly white smile, attributing it to exactly this ritual. It was not a secret. It was not shameful. It was simply practical chemistry in a world without laboratories. Think about what this means. For thousands of years, humans have been working out the rules of the physical world through trial and error. No white coats, no peer review, no clinical trials, just careful observation passed down through generations of women sharing what worked. Here is the gentle irony. We look back at this practice and cringe, but we are standing in the same tradition of experimentation. We just have the luxury of distance. Our great-grandchildren may well look at some of our current beauty rituals with the exact same mixture of fascination and horror. Every generation believes it has finally figured it all out. Every generation, it turns out, is improvising. Imagine being handed a pot of the most luxurious, creamy white face paint you have ever seen. It smooths on like silk. It makes your skin look porcelain pale, radiant, almost luminous. Everyone who matters in your social world wears it. It is the marker of femininity, of wealth, of beauty. And it is slowly killing you. Lead-based cosmetics, most notably a substance called cerussa, or white lead, were among the most widely used beauty products in ancient Rome. Women applied it to their faces, necks, and sometimes arms to achieve that coveted pale complexion. Some also used it as a foundation for other colours, layering rouge made from other compounds on top. The tragedy is that the effects were not immediately obvious. Lead poisoning is a slow, quiet thing. It causes fatigue and confusion at first, then hair loss, then more serious neurological damage. Women who used these products daily for years would have experienced a gradual, bewildering deterioration, and because no one connected the beautiful pot on the dressing table to the illness in the body, they simply kept using it. Here is where history becomes something almost unbearably poignant. These women were not careless. They were not uninformed in any way their society could have made them informed. They were doing exactly what they were told beautiful women did. They were following the rules of their world. How many things do we do today, confidently, that future generations will look back on with the same quiet grief? We are always, in some sense, living inside a knowledge gap we cannot see. The Romans and their lead paint remind us of that humbling truth. Beauty culture has always carried a cost, and not always one we can see in time. Close your eyes and picture this. You are in a lush Roman garden, the kind with fountains and flowering vines and the sound of birds threading through warm air. On a stone table sits a small clay jar, sealed with wax. Inside it, distilled and carefully prepared, is something extracted from one of nature's most feared creatures. Snake venom. Roman women used preparations containing snake venom and snake fat as skin treatments, believing these substances had powerful regenerative and anti-aging properties. Snake fat in particular was prized for its ability to smooth wrinkles and restore suppleness to aging skin. Snake venom, with its intense biological potency, was thought to tighten the skin and arrest the signs of time. And here is the remarkable thing: modern cosmetic science has actually circled back to this idea. Synthetic snake venom compounds are now used in some high-end anti-aging creams, where they work by temporarily relaxing facial muscles in a way that mimics, on a small scale, the effect of certain toxins. The Romans did not know the mechanism, but they noticed the effect. Think about that for a moment. 2,000 years ago, a woman in a Roman garden reached for a jar of snake venom to fight time on her face. Today, a woman in a modern city reaches for a jar with a sleek label and similar chemistry, just refined and repackaged. There is something almost elegant about this continuity, the ancient and the modern reaching across millennia, sharing the same fundamental fear, the same fundamental hope. We have always been afraid of time. We have always looked for ways to bargain with it. Perhaps the snake, sloughing off its skin to emerge renewed, felt like the perfect symbol all along. Picture yourself sinking into a warm bath. Not water alone, something richer, softer, almost velvety against your skin. The scent is faintly sweet and clean. Around you, attendants move quietly. Outside the walls of this bathhouse, the city hums and breathes. This is the bath of Poppaea Sabina, wife of the Emperor Nero, one of the most famously beauty-obsessed women in all of Roman history. and her bath is filled with donkey milk. Poppaea reportedly travelled with a herd of 500 lactating donkeys specifically to ensure a fresh supply wherever she went. Every day, she bathed in their milk, believing, correctly as it happens, that it kept her skin luminously soft and young. Donkey milk is nutritionally extraordinary. It is rich in vitamins A, B, C, D and E, in fatty acids, and in proteins that have genuine skin barrier supporting properties. Modern cosmetic companies now use donkey milk in expensive skincare lines, marketing it as a cutting-edge ingredient. Poppaea was ahead of them by roughly 2,000 years. Now 500 donkeys is an almost comically extravagant detail. But strip away the excess, and what do you find? A woman who paid close attention to what worked, who had the resources to pursue it without compromise, and who understood something real about her own body. Here is the thought worth carrying. Throughout history, the knowledge that women held about their own bodies, about plants, substances, preparations, rituals, was often dismissed as superstition or vanity, and yet so much of it was rooted in real, careful, accumulated observation. Poppaea and her donkeys might have the last laugh after all. The science, it turns out, was on her side. Hold this image in your mind. The sand beneath your sandals is hot. The crowd above is deafening, a living wall of sound pressing down from every direction. You are not watching. You are standing in the center of the arena, shield in hand, body coiled, eyes fixed on the figure across from you. You are a woman, and you are about to fight. Female gladiators, known as gladiatresses, existed in ancient Rome, and while they were never as numerous or as formally institutionalized as their male counterparts, they were real, documented, and crowd-pleasing enough to have been both celebrated and eventually banned. The Emperor Domitian reportedly staged fights between women by torchlight as a spectacle novelty. Inscriptions and sculptures referencing female fighters have been found, and the Roman writer Juvenal, writing with clear distaste, described women training with weapons and fighting in the arena. It is that distaste that tells us something important. The fact that moralists wrote about gladiatresses with disapproval confirms they were visible and prominent enough to require disapproving. You do not bother to condemn what no one is paying attention to. The ban eventually came under Emperor Septimius Severus in around 200 BC, who prohibited women of free birth from participating in arena combat. The prohibition itself is a kind of tribute. It acknowledges that they were there, that they were fighting, and that someone in power felt threatened enough to make it stop. Think about what it took. To train, to enter that sand, to face a crowd that might cheer you or jeer you with equal passion. These women fought in a world that gave them almost no formal power. And then some of them walked into the most public arena in the world and fought anyway. That is a particular kind of courage, the kind history tends to bury, but never quite manages to erase. Let yourself sit with complexity here, because this topic asks for it. Imagine walking toward a great temple at dusk, the air thick with incense, the walls golden in fading light. Inside, rituals are being performed that blur the line between the sacred and the intimate, between devotion and transaction, between power and its absence. The concept of sacred prostitution, the practice of sexual service performed within a religious context, sometimes as an act of worship, appears in ancient sources connected to various temples and cults that existed within or alongside Roman society. The cult of Venus, Isis, and several imported Eastern mystery religions were associated, rightly or wrongly by ancient commentators, with women who offered sexual services in a sacred context. Historians debate fiercely how widespread or formalized this actually was. Some argue the ancient sources exaggerated or misunderstood foreign practices. Others point to evidence that at least some form of ritualized sexual service existed in certain cult contexts. What is less debatable is the Roman legal and social architecture around female sexuality. Rome had an elaborate system of categories for women: the respectable matron, The prostitute, the slave, and the law treated them entirely differently depending on which category they occupied. A woman's sexual availability or unavailability was, in the eyes of Roman law, central to her identity and worth. This is the quiet horror beneath the historical curiosity. Not the rituals themselves, but the system that sorted women into categories by their relationship to male desire, and then used those categories to determine their entire social existence. Here is the philosophical thread. Every society organizes the world around the things it fears and the things it desires. Ancient Rome feared uncontrolled female sexuality and built an entire legal architecture to contain it. The architecture changes across centuries. The fear, unfortunately, has proven more durable. Picture a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, chosen from among Rome's most elite families. She is led to a temple at the heart of the city. Her hair is cut. A white veil is placed over her head. She will spend the next 30 years of her life in service to the goddess Vesta, keeper of the sacred flame. She is a Vestal virgin, and she is simultaneously the most protected and the most endangered woman in Rome. The 6 Vestal virgins occupied one of the most extraordinary social positions in all of Roman history. They were among the only women in Rome who held legal independence. They could own property, make contracts, and move through public life without a male guardian. They had reserved seats at public games, front row seats at the Colosseum. When their carriage passed through Rome's streets, even senior magistrates stepped aside, and yet the price of this extraordinary privilege was absolute. A Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was not simply disgraced, she was buried alive. The logic was stark and unsentimental. The Vestals maintained the sacred flame that, in Roman belief, was directly tied to the survival of Rome itself. Their purity was not a personal virtue, it was a national security matter. Their bodies were, quite literally, understood to be a civic resource. 30 years of service, and then, if they survived, they were released. Free to marry, free to live. Most chose not to. After 3 decades of being simultaneously the most revered and most constrained women in the city, ordinary domestic life must have seemed almost incomprehensible. There is something quietly haunting here, to be so powerful and so controlled at once, to hold a flame for 30 years and never truly belong to yourself. History is full of women who were elevated and caged in the same breath. Smile for a moment and think about your morning routine. Chances are, somewhere in that routine, there is a tube of white paste, perhaps a whitening strip, perhaps a carefully selected toothbrush. Bright, clean teeth are so woven into our idea of health and attractiveness that we barely think about it. We just do it. So did the Romans, with wildly different tools. Roman teeth whitening was a multi-substance endeavour, and the ingredients ranged from the merely unpleasant to the deeply alarming. Urine, as we have already touched on, was a primary tool due to its ammonia content. But Roman women also used powders made from crushed bone, oyster shells, and pumice stone to scrub their teeth. Some used mixtures incorporating burnt eggshells or the ash of animal hooves, all applied with rough cloths or primitive brush-like tools. The Roman poet Ovid, in his beauty writings, specifically advised women on dental care as part of overall grooming. A beautiful smile was considered an important component of feminine attractiveness. This was not vanity in the trivial sense, it was social currency. And here is the fascinating thing. Some of these methods worked. Pumice is a real abrasive. Certain ash compounds are mildly antiseptic. The Romans did not have fluoride or clinical research, but they had centuries of accumulated observation and a powerful social motivation to keep testing. The aha moment here is tender rather than dramatic. Across thousands of years of human history, people have been standing in front of their reflections, scrubbing their teeth, hoping to look their best before walking out into the world. The tools have changed almost beyond recognition. The feeling before the mirror, has not changed at all. Think about trust for a moment. Real trust. The kind where you hand someone the most precious thing in your world and walk away. In ancient Rome, wealthy women commonly employed wet nurses to breastfeed their infants, and these arrangements were governed by formal, detailed, legal contracts. The contracts specified everything: what the nurse could eat and drink, whether she was allowed sexual activity during the nursing period, how much she would be paid, and what would happen if the infant died or the nurse failed in her duties. The reasoning behind dietary restrictions was rooted in Roman medical belief that the quality of breast milk was directly affected by what the nursing woman consumed. Wine was often restricted, spicy foods were limited, sexual intercourse was sometimes forbidden on the grounds that it might alter the milk or, according to some physicians, trigger another pregnancy that would compete with milk production. Most wet nurses were enslaved women or women of lower economic standing. This is a detail history tends to rush past, but it deserves to be held still for a moment. These women nourished the children of Rome's elite with their own bodies, often while separated from their own children. The law treated their bodies as a contracted resource. Their own maternal experience was considered largely irrelevant. And yet, here is the complicated truth. Many of these relationships became profound. Roman literature contains accounts of wet nurses who remained beloved members of a household for life, who were mourned at their deaths, who were considered family in all but legal name. The human heart, it seems, has always found ways to make connection inside systems designed to prevent it. That is not a comfort, exactly. But it is a truth worth honouring. Here is something that will shift your assumptions about ancient Rome if you hold the common one that all ancient women were entirely powerless. Roman women could divorce their husbands, not easily and not without social cost, but the legal mechanism existed. In Rome, divorce was achieved essentially by mutual declaration or the persistent will of either party. A woman could initiate separation from her husband by simply removing herself and her belongings from the marital home and declaring the marriage ended. Under certain forms of Roman marriage, particularly the freer arrangement called sine manu marriage, women retained their legal connection to their birth family rather than passing into their husband's legal control, and this gave them real leverage. Elite Roman women exercised this right with a frequency that made male moralists deeply anxious. Cicero's wife Terentia divorced him. Julius Caesar divorced his second wife. Multiple remarriages among the Roman elite were common enough that satirists complained bitterly about women who, as one writer put it, counted their years not by consuls but by husbands. Underneath the moral panic, something real was happening. Roman women of the property class were navigating their own interests, sometimes with remarkable skill, in a system that was not designed for their comfort. The philosophical reflection here is one of quiet admiration with a realistic edge. These women were not equal. They were not free in the way we understand freedom. But within the narrow corridors that the law opened to them, some of them moved with extraordinary intention. History rarely gives us heroines in the grand dramatic sense. More often, it gives us women who found the small door in the wall and walked through it. These women found the door. Sit with this for a moment. In much of the ancient world, women had no legal existence separate from the men in their lives: father, husband, son. They could not own property, make contracts, appear in court, or conduct business. They were, legally speaking, extensions of the men who held authority over them. Rome was not entirely that world. Roman women, particularly those of the citizen and elite classes, had meaningful, and by ancient standards quite remarkable, rights to own and manage property. Under certain marriage arrangements, a woman retained ownership of the dowry she brought to the marriage. She could inherit, bequeath, and manage property directly. Wealthy Roman widows, in particular, could become significant economic actors, controlling estates, making business decisions, and managing agricultural operations. The papyrus records and legal documents that survive from Roman Egypt, which was a province of Rome, show women buying and selling property, entering into contracts, and managing businesses with a regularity that suggests this was genuinely normalized rather than exceptional. Now, was this equality? No. A poor woman in Rome had none of these protections. A slave woman had none. The benefits of Roman property law were concentrated among the privileged, as benefits so often are. But here is why this matters beyond the legal technicality. Property meant options. Property meant that a woman who chose to leave a bad marriage had somewhere to go. Property meant that a widow was not automatically destitute. Property meant that some women, in some circumstances, could make real choices about their real lives. The Romans did not design their legal system with feminist principles in mind. But in the gaps and peculiarities of that system, some women found something genuinely worth having: a foothold. And sometimes that is enough to change everything. This one asks you to step into a mindset very different from your own, and to do it without judgment, only curiosity. Imagine living in a world where the natural rhythms of your body are not just personal, they are cosmological, where what happens inside you is believed to ripple outward into crops and wine and bees, and the very turning of the natural world. That was the Roman relationship with menstruation. Pliny the Elder, one of Rome's great encyclopedists, devoted considerable space in his natural history to the supposed powers and dangers of menstrual blood. His list is extraordinary. Menstrual blood, he wrote, could kill crops if a woman walked through a field. It could tarnish bronze, dull iron, and kill bees. It could calm a hailstorm, apparently, if a woman lifted her clothing in its direction. The logic, internally consistent within Roman natural philosophy, was that menstrual blood was an extremely powerful substance, the most potent kind of bodily fluid, and that power was understood as simultaneously dangerous and useful, depending on context. What is striking is the ambivalence. Roman superstition around menstruation was not simply one of disgust and pollution, though that element was present. It was also one of awe. The body that could produce this substance was understood as genuinely powerful, genuinely capable of affecting the world. Here is the gentle aha. Across history, cultures have tended to both fear and mythologize what they do not fully understand. The menstruating body in Rome was a mystery powerful enough to require a mythology to contain it. The mythology was wrong, but the instinct to take that power seriously? Perhaps in its own complicated way, that part was not entirely off. Catch a reflection in something, a window, a screen, a quiet surface of water. Think about your hair, and think about the last time you considered changing it. Hair, across every human culture and every era of recorded history, has been one of our most personal, most expressive, most emotionally loaded features. And Roman women knew this with absolute clarity. Hair dyeing in ancient Rome was widespread, varied, and deeply embedded in the culture's understanding of beauty and identity. Roman women used a range of methods and substances to alter their hair colour, each with its own social meaning. Black hair was associated with sensuality and exoticism. Blonde and red hair, associated with Germanic and Gallic women, were considered glamorously foreign and highly sought after. To achieve blonde, Roman women used a combination of methods. Some applied nutshells or plant-based bleaches. The more dramatic opted for wigs made from the hair of conquered Germanic women, which were sold in Rome as luxury items. There is something uncomfortable in that detail. The beauty ideal of blonde hair was achieved, in part, by literally wearing the hair of women Rome had defeated in war. For darker shades, leech-based dyes and various plant compounds were used. The Roman poet Ovid cautioned women not to over-dye, noting with characteristic practicality that excessive chemical treatment would damage the hair, a warning any modern salon client would recognize immediately. The philosophical thread here is one of identity and longing. We change our hair when we want to change our story, when we want to feel more powerful, more beautiful, more ourselves, or sometimes entirely someone else. The Roman woman reaching for her hair dye was doing exactly the same thing. 2,000 years apart. One mirror, the same hope. Let yourself enter this one slowly, because grief asks for slowness. Imagine a Roman household the morning after a death, the front door draped in cypress branches to warn passers-by that death lives here. Inside, the sound of mourning, not quiet, private, contained grief, but loud, public, formal lamentation. Women at the centre of it, voices raised, hands moving in ritual gestures that have been passed down through generations. In ancient Rome, women were the designated mourners. Grief was considered a female domain, not because Roman men did not feel loss, but because the public expression of emotional vulnerability was assigned to women as both a role and a responsibility. Hired mourners, called praefacae, were professional women paid to lead the mourning procession and amplify the grief of the crowd. They were experts in the art of lamentation. They knew the right songs, the right gestures, the right volume and rhythm of grief to properly honour the dead and signal to the community the significance of the loss. Roman law at various points actually tried to limit the extravagance of mourning, restricting the number of mourners, the length of funerary processions, the expense of burial. The fact that these laws had to be passed repeatedly suggests they were not especially effective. Women also had prescribed mourning periods. A widow was expected to mourn for a specific duration before she could remarry. This was partly about social propriety, but it was also, in a quieter way, a recognition that grief needs time. Here is what history offers us in this ritual. Every culture that has ever existed has had to answer the same question: what do we do with our grief? Rome's answer was communal, public, and entrusted to women. There is something quietly beautiful in that. Grief was not meant to be hidden. It was meant to be witnessed. Think about the last beauty trend you noticed without quite understanding. The thing everyone seemed to be doing to their faces that seemed to require explanation. Eyebrows, it turns out, have always been that thing. In ancient Rome, eyebrow fashion was a serious, debated, and highly specific preoccupation. The ideal Roman female eyebrow was a thing of remarkable precision. It was supposed to be a single, continuous, gently curved line meeting at the bridge of the nose. Yes, you read that correctly. The unibrow was not merely tolerated in ancient Rome, it was considered beautiful. Women who did not naturally have this feature darkened and extended their brows with a cosmetic made from antimony or ash to create the joined effect. Ovid, that endlessly practical beauty commentator, mentioned eyebrows specifically in his cosmetic writings, emphasizing that a well-shaped, softly connected brow was a mark of classical feminine beauty. This seems almost impossible to reconcile with modern beauty standards, where significant effort and expense goes into keeping brows very specifically separated. But that is precisely the point. Beauty standards are arbitrary. They are culturally constructed, socially enforced, and historically contingent. What one era tweezes away, another fills in with a cosmetic pencil. What one generation removes, another glues back on. The Roman woman carefully darkening her brow to achieve the perfect connected line was doing something completely rational within her cultural context, signalling conformity to the beauty ideal of her time, communicating that she understood and participated in the visual language of her world. The aha here is both simple and quietly liberating. There is no objectively correct eyebrow. There never has been. There is only the brow of the moment, and the women patient enough to keep up with it. Take one more slow breath, and let this one be aromatic. Imagine the markets of ancient Rome, an overwhelming sensory landscape. Spices from India, resins from Arabia, flowers from across the Mediterranean, all converging in the workshops of perfumers who were among the most skilled and highly valued craftspeople in the city. Roman women were, by almost every historical account, deeply and unapologetically obsessed with perfume. Roman perfumery was extraordinarily sophisticated. Fragrances were created from roses, saffron, cinnamon, myrrh, frankincense, and dozens of other ingredients, blended and pressed in oils or dissolved in wine-based solutions. The perfume trade connected Rome to every corner of the known world, and Roman women were the primary consumers driving that trade. Perfume was applied to the body, the hair, the clothing, and even to pets and household spaces. Elite women might wear several different fragrances simultaneously for different parts of the body. Specific scents were associated with specific deities, roses with Venus, for example, so wearing perfume carried a devotional dimension as well as a personal one. Pliny complained about the expense. Moralists wrote that excessive perfume use was a symptom of feminine luxury and moral loosening, which tells us again that women were doing it in numbers large enough to require complaining about. Here is the final thought for this segment, and perhaps for this collection of portraits. Across all of these strange, fascinating, sometimes troubling, sometimes tender practices, a single truth keeps emerging. Roman women were fully, richly, complexly human. They feared time and chased beauty and bent rules and grieved deeply and held power wherever they could find it. They painted their faces and bathed in milk and burned incense and mourned their dead loudly in the streets. They were, in every way that matters, recognizably us, and the perfume they left behind, if we are quiet enough to catch it, still drifts across 2,000 years. Cast your mind back to a morning routine that feels nothing like your own. The sun has barely crested the hills above Rome. Inside a modest home, a young woman stands in the low golden light while an attendant winds a long band of linen firmly around her chest. Not for medical reasons, not because something is wrong. This is simply part of dressing, as unremarkable to her as buttoning a shirt is to you. Breast binding in ancient Rome was a common practice, particularly among younger women and those engaged in physical activity. The garment used was called a strophium or fascia, a band of soft cloth or leather worn tightly around the chest beneath outer clothing. Athletes and performers relied on it for practical support, but ordinary Roman women wore variations of it as part of daily dress, and it served both functional and aesthetic purposes. The Roman ideal of the female form favoured a relatively restrained silhouette. Modesty in bodily presentation was considered a virtue, not in a punishing sense, but in the way that self-containment was broadly admired in Roman culture across genders. The strophium helped achieve the controlled, composed appearance that Roman aesthetic standards valued. There is something worth pausing on here. Every culture has garments that reshape the body toward its current ideal. The corset, the girdle, the padded shoulder, the shapewear of today. Each era looks at the human body and asks it to become something slightly different, something that communicates belonging, taste, status. The Roman woman binding her chest each morning was not oppressed by this ritual any more than we feel oppressed by our own. She was, in her own way, dressing for her world. And is that not, in the end, exactly what we all do? We clothe ourselves in the language of our time, and we walk out into our lives. Let yourself drift into this one gently. Envision walking through a Roman street market on a warm afternoon. Vendors call out from every direction. The smell of bread and fish, and something floral from a nearby stall. And around you, on nearly every woman and child you pass, something gleams, a small pendant, a carved charm, a tiny figure of a god hanging from a cord or chain at the throat. Amulets were everywhere in ancient Rome, and Roman women wore them with genuine, sincere devotion. The range of amulets was extraordinary. There were lunular pendants, crescent moon-shaped charms worn by girls to honour Diana and protect feminine health. There were tiny figures of Isis, Fortuna and Venus. There were bulla, rounded capsule-shaped pendants filled with protective substances, and fashionum charms shaped like a phallus, worn to ward off the evil eye. There were amulets made from specific stones believed to carry healing or protective properties, amber and coral among the most prized. These were not merely decorative. Roman women believed these objects held real power, that they created a kind of invisible armouring around the wearer, a constant conversation between the human body and the forces of the unseen world. Now think about what we carry for comfort. A grandmother's ring worn even after it no longer fits, a specific bracelet put on before a difficult day, a small object in a pocket that grounds us when the world tilts. We call it sentiment. Romans called it protection. But the underlying impulse, the desire to carry something small and meaningful close to the body, to feel accompanied by something beyond the visible, is precisely the same. We have never entirely stopped believing that the right small object, worn close to the heart, might just keep the darkness back. Here is an invitation. Think back to the last dream that stayed with you after waking, the one where the imagery was too specific to dismiss, too emotionally vivid to shake off with coffee and morning light. The one where some part of you wondered, even briefly, whether it was trying to tell you something. Roman women did not push that feeling aside. They leaned into it with everything they had. Dream interpretation in ancient Rome was a serious, culturally respected practice. Dreams were not considered random neural noise. They were understood as genuine communications, from the gods, from the spirits of the dead, from the deeper currents of fate itself. A significant dream was to be analysed, recorded, and discussed with care. The most important surviving text on the subject is the Onira Critica, written by Artemidorus in the 2nd century of the Common Era, a 5-volume manual for dream interpretation that categorized dreams and explained their prophetic meanings in remarkable detail. Roman women consulted dream interpreters much as people today might consult therapists or astrologers, particularly around major life events, pregnancy, illness, marriage, the death of a family member. Roman women paid intense attention to their dreams. A dream about a specific animal, a particular object, or a visit from a deceased relative carried meaning that could inform real decisions. Here is the aha, and it is a quietly wonderful one. Modern neuroscience tells us that dreaming is deeply connected to emotional processing, memory consolidation, and problem solving. Our brains really are working through something while we sleep. The Roman woman consulting her dream for guidance was not being irrational. She was listening to her own mind in the only language it could speak at 3 a.m. Perhaps the ancients were not so different from us after all. Perhaps we have simply changed what we call the process. Picture yourself in a fabric shop, running your hand along the most extraordinary cloth you have ever touched. Light as a whisper, cool as water, shimmering with a quality that seems almost alive. That is silk, and when it first arrived in Rome, it caused something close to a moral emergency. Silk reached Rome along the great trade networks of the ancient world, and it immediately became the most coveted textile in the city. Roman women of the elite classes wanted it desperately and wore it with visible pleasure. And Roman men, or at least the ones doing the writing, were, to put it gently, not pleased about this. The objections were multiple, and all of them are fascinating. Silk was described as dangerously revealing, so fine and close-fitting that it left little to the imagination, and Roman moralists argued it was barely different from wearing nothing. It was also extravagantly expensive, requiring enormous quantities of Roman gold to flow eastward to pay for it, which triggered genuine economic anxiety. The Emperor Tiberius at one point attempted to ban men from wearing silk at all, though his concerns about women's silk wearing are also recorded. Pliny the Elder was particularly exercised about the whole situation, lamenting the vast sums Rome was spending on luxuries from India and the East for what he clearly considered unworthy purposes. And yet the silk kept coming, and Roman women kept wearing it. Here is the quiet observation worth lingering on. Throughout history, the things that authorities have tried hardest to ban from women's wardrobes have invariably been the things that gave women pleasure, visibility, and agency over their own presentation. The anxiety was never really about the fabric. It never is. It was about what women felt like inside it. Step into this with all your senses: warm, mineral-scented steam, the low murmur of conversation echoing off marble walls, the sound of water, steady and vast, and around you, dozens of women moving through the ritual of bathing with the calm ease of people doing something deeply ordinary. Welcome to the Roman Thermae, the great public bathhouses that were one of the defining social institutions of ancient Roman life. Roman women bathed publicly, regularly, and with great enthusiasm. The largest bathhouses were extraordinary architectural achievements, heated rooms progressing from warm to hot to scalding and back to cool, with pools for soaking, rooms for exercise, spaces for oiling and scraping the skin, and areas for simply resting and talking. Some complexes included libraries, gardens, and food vendors. Women bathed either in separate sections from men or at different hours, depending on the facility and the era. But the participation of women in public bathing culture was not marginal, it was central. The baths were where Roman women of various social classes met, talked, shared information, maintained relationships, and conducted the informal social business of daily life. This is where it becomes interesting to modern eyes. The bathhouse was one of the few genuinely public spaces where Roman women from different social backgrounds encountered each other regularly. A freeborn citizen woman and a freedwoman might share the same pool on any given afternoon. Think about our own third places: the coffee shop, the gym, the community pool, the places that are not home and not work, but somewhere in between, where the city becomes briefly intimate. Roman women had the baths. And in those warm, steaming, candlelit rooms, the city talked to itself. Community, it turns out, has always needed a warm place to gather. Rome just had better architecture. Take a breath here, because this one reaches into something very deep and very human. Envision yourself in a small, dimly lit room in a Roman home. The air is close and warm. On a low bed, a woman labours, surrounded by female attendants, midwives, family members, perhaps a neighbour experienced in these matters. On a small shelf nearby, offerings burn before a figure of Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth. Someone is praying. Several people, perhaps, all at once, their lips moving in quiet, urgent petition. Childbirth in ancient Rome was genuinely dangerous. Maternal and infant mortality rates were high by modern standards. A Roman woman going into labour was doing something that carried real, understood risk. Everyone in that room knew it. And so prayer was not supplemental to the process, it was integral. Roman women invoked Juno Lucina specifically, as her name connected both to light and to the act of bringing forth, bringing the child into light. They prayed to Diana, associated with women in transition. They called on Carmenta, a goddess believed to govern the fates of newborns. Specific prayers, specific offerings, specific ritual words were recited at particular moments in labour. The midwife's work and the goddess's favour were not considered separate systems. They were understood as working together. Here is what this touches in us, regardless of our beliefs. When the people we love are in danger, and we cannot fix it with our hands, we reach. We reach towards something beyond ourselves, a prayer, a hope, a fervent, quiet wish sent out into the universe. Roman women reach toward Juno Lucina. The direction changes across centuries and cultures, but the reaching, the fierce, helpless, hopeful reaching towards something larger than fear, that is one of the most enduring things about being human. Here is something that might make you do a double take. In the early centuries of Roman history, women were legally prohibited from drinking wine. Not discouraged, not frowned upon, prohibited. And the penalty for violation, according to some sources, could be as severe as death. Let that land for a moment. Wine was among the most central substances in Roman culture. It was mixed with water and drunk at every meal by men across the social spectrum. It was offered to the gods. It flowed at celebrations, at funerals, at political gatherings. Wine was, in many ways, the liquid currency of Roman social life. And Roman women were, at certain points in Roman history, formally excluded from it. The reasoning given was characteristically Roman in its blunt logic. Wine was associated with loosened inhibitions, and loosened inhibitions in women were associated with sexual transgression. The great Roman historian Cato reported that a husband had the right to kiss his wife to check whether her breath carried wine. He was, in essence, legally authorized to conduct a sobriety test. Over time, as Rome expanded and social mores shifted, these restrictions relaxed considerably. By the late Republic and Imperial period, elite Roman women were clearly drinking wine at dinner parties, and the laws had faded into historical memory. But the stigma took longer to dissolve than the law did. What does this tell us? It tells us that the things a society chooses to restrict from a particular group of people reveal exactly which freedoms that society is most afraid of sharing. Wine meant presence at the table. Presence at the table meant participation in conversation. Conversation meant influence. The wine was never really the point. It was what the wine represented, a seat at the table that certain people were not yet willing to offer. You might assume that because Roman women could not vote, hold office, or speak in the Senate, they had no political power. That assumption deserves to be gently and thoroughly dismantled. Step into the mental image of a Roman dinner party, the triclinium, where guests recline on cushioned couches, food and wine circulating freely, conversation moving fluidly between culture, philosophy, and the pressing political affairs of the day. At the centre of this room, hosting with precision and intelligence, is a Roman matron. She knows every guest's ambitions. She has read the letters. She understands the alliances. Roman women of the elite class exercised political influence through what historians sometimes call the informal channels of power, and those channels ran deep and fast. Livia, wife of the Emperor Augustus, was widely understood to be one of the most politically influential people in Rome. Full stop. Ancient sources describe her involvement in appointments, pardons, and policy in terms that leave little ambiguity. Fulvia, wife of Mark Antony, commanded troops and governed territories in her husband's absence. Agrippina the Younger was said to have engineered the succession of her son Nero to the emperorship with extraordinary strategic precision. These were not exceptions. They were the visible peaks of a much broader practice of women exercising power through the relationships and households they managed. Here is the philosophical observation. History has often been written as though formal power and real power are the same thing. Roman women were excluded from formal power almost entirely, and yet the actual running of Rome, its social networks, its inheritance patterns, its family alliances, passed substantially through women's hands. Real power has never required a title. It has always required relationships, information, and nerve. Roman women, it turns out, had all three in abundance. Think about the largest financial transaction most people experience in their lifetime. A house, perhaps, or the cost of an education. Something that requires legal documents, extended conversations, a representative to speak on your behalf, and a deep breath before you sign. In ancient Rome, that transaction was the dowry, and it was negotiated before a woman's marriage with the seriousness and complexity of a major business deal. The Roman dowry, called the dues, was a transfer of property or money from the bride's family to the groom to support the new household. But what made the Roman system interesting, and somewhat different from other ancient cultures, was the legal expectation that the dowry would be returned to the woman or her family if the marriage ended through divorce or the husband's death. This meant that the dowry was not simply a gift to the groom. It was, in a real legal sense, still tied to the woman, a financial anchor that accompanied her through marriage and theoretically out the other side. Negotiations over the dowry involved fathers, legal representatives, sometimes professional mediators. The amount and composition of the dowry signalled family status, financial health, and the relative bargaining positions of both families. A well-negotiated dowry could protect a woman's material future in ways that had lasting, practical consequences. Think of it as something between a prenuptial agreement and an investment portfolio, a financial structure built around a woman before her marriage that was meant, at least theoretically, to travel with her. The aha here is about the gap between intention and reality. The legal protections were real. Whether they were enforced consistently was another matter entirely, and depended heavily on the power and will of the families involved. Good laws and their consistent application, as every era discovers, are not automatically the same thing. Let the night in for a moment. Picture a Roman city after dark, most of it quiet, the streets dimly lit by oil lamps in windows, the great public spaces emptied. But in certain households and certain hidden outdoor spaces, women have gathered. The hour is late. The atmosphere is intentional. Something is being performed that daylight does not quite suit. Midnight rituals and nocturnal religious ceremonies involving women appear throughout Roman historical and literary sources, often described with a mixture of fascination, anxiety, and outright condemnation from male writers, which, as we have observed, is usually a sign that something significant was happening. The Bona Dea festival was among the most well-documented of these. Held annually in early December, it was a religious ceremony conducted exclusively by women, no men permitted, under any circumstances, presided over by the wife of whichever magistrate hosted it that year. Wine was consumed, though it was ritually referred to by a different name, and rites were performed in honour of the goddess. When the politician Clodius disguised himself as a woman to sneak into one such ceremony, the scandal was city-shaking. Beyond formal festivals, Roman women participated in mystery cults, consulted with female diviners, and performed private household rituals at hours and in ways that official Roman religion did not always fully sanction. Here is what the night offered that the day could not: privacy, freedom from observation, space to be something other than what the daylight roles required. Every culture has its midnight, its spaces at the edge of the official, where the things that cannot be said in sunlight find their voice. Roman women found theirs in torchlit rooms, with the doors closed, in ceremonies the men outside were never meant to understand. There is something quietly intimate about a letter. Think about the last time you wrote something by hand to someone you cared about. Not a text, not an email, something pressed into paper with a pen, something physical that travelled through space and arrived in another person's hands. There is a particular kind of presence in that act. A piece of you, carried. Roman women wrote letters. This seems simple to state, but the implications are worth sitting with. Literacy in the ancient world was not universal. It was heavily skewed toward men and toward the elite, and yet the archaeological and literary record contains substantial evidence of Roman women composing, sending and receiving letters, both within Rome itself and across the empire's vast geography. The most famous surviving collection belongs not to a woman, but illuminates them vividly. Cicero's letters to his wife Terentia and the few fragments of her replies show a married couple conducting genuine correspondence across political crisis and distance. Not domestic pleasantries, but substantive discussions of property, finance, political danger, and family strategy. The Vindolanda tablets, a remarkable collection of wooden writing tablets found at a Roman fort in northern Britain, include a letter from one army officer's wife to another, inviting her to a birthday celebration. It is the oldest surviving handwritten document by a woman in Britain. A social invitation preserved 2,000 years. There is the aha, and it is a gentle one. Behind every major political event of the Roman world, there were letters moving quietly between women, arranging, informing, consoling, organising. History recorded the speeches in the Senate. The letters, when they survived, recorded everything else. Women have always found the means to speak to each other, even when the official channels were not built for them. Picture yourself sitting very still in a well-lit room, hands occupied, rhythmically doing something repetitive. Perhaps you are knitting, crocheting, folding something. The movement is almost meditative. Your hands know what to do without asking your brain, and so your mind is free to wander, to think, to be quietly present while your fingers work. Roman women knew this feeling intimately. Wool-working, spinning, weaving, and the entire process of transforming raw fleece into cloth was so central to the idealized identity of a Roman woman that it became a kind of moral symbol. The perfect Roman matron was, by the standards of literary and philosophical tradition, always at her wool. The epitaph for an idealized Roman wife might simply read, "She spun wool." This was not a minor compliment. It was the highest form of domestic praise. The association ran so deep that wool-working implements, the spindle and distaff, became symbols of feminine virtue, domesticity, and continuity. Brides carried a distaff on their wedding day. Great women of history were praised for their wool-working alongside their other virtues. Augustus, in a pointed domestic statement, reportedly wore clothing woven by the women of his household. The economic reality behind this symbol was also significant. Roman households produced much of their own cloth, and this was skilled, time-consuming labour that required knowledge, practice, and patience. It was not trivial work dressed up as virtue. It was essential work that had been reframed as virtue because essential women's work so often is. Here is the tender observation waiting at the end of this thread. The things we do with our hands while our minds are free are not nothing. They are where much of thinking actually happens, where plans are made and grief is processed and the quiet work of life gets done. Roman women knew that. The distaff understood it too. Here is something that will stop you in your tracks if you have not encountered it before. Roman women, for most of Roman history, did not have personal first names in the way that men did. Take a moment with that. A Roman man had 3 names: a personal name, a family name, and a surname. A Roman woman, however, was typically known only by the feminine form of her father's family name. A daughter of the Iulius family was simply called Iulia. Another daughter of the same family would also be called Iulia. If there were multiple daughters, they might be distinguished as Iulia Major and Iulia Minor, elder and younger, or Iulia I, Iulia II, Iulia III. This was not informal. It was the formal naming convention for Roman women across centuries. The implications of this are both practical and deeply philosophical. On the practical side, historians find it genuinely complicated to distinguish between Roman women of the same family in historical records. On the philosophical side, the convention tells us something stark about Roman assumptions. A woman was understood, in her very name, as an extension of her family lineage rather than as a distinct individual. She was Iulia because her father was Iulius. Her identity, at its most foundational level, the thing people called her, was a reference to him. And yet, within households, Roman women clearly used familiar names, nicknames, terms of affection. They were called by diminutives and personal forms that do not always survive in the formal record. There is the quiet aha. Official naming conventions tell us what a society values publicly. Nicknames tell us who people actually were to each other. Roman women were erased from one record and kept alive in another. History preserved the erasure. Love preserved the person. Settle into this one like you would settle into a memory of someone you have lost. Gently. With presence. In ancient Rome, death was not a private, hidden thing. It was a public event, shaped by ritual, governed by tradition, and managed with an attention to form and meaning that speaks to how seriously the Romans took the passage between life and what came after. And at the centre of Roman funeral rites once again, were women. Roman funerals began with the conclamatio, the ritual calling of the deceased's name by family members, repeated 3 times, as if calling them back from whatever threshold they had crossed. This was typically led by women. The laying out of the body, its washing and anointing and dressing, was women's work. The preparation of the funeral couch, the arrangement of flowers and offerings, the burning of incense, all of this fell to the female members of the household. Female mourners, both family members and for wealthier households, professional préfecats, walked in the funeral procession, their expressions of grief visible and audible, their voices part of the public announcement that a soul had departed and deserved witness. After cremation or burial, women maintained the grave. They returned on specific feast days to lay offerings, pour libations, and speak to the dead in a practice called parentatio, a yearly ritual of familial commemoration during the festival of Parentalia in February. The dead, in Roman belief, needed the living to remember them in order to rest. And the living, in practice, needed the ritual of remembrance in order to continue. Think about your own rituals around grief, the grave you visit, the date you do not let pass unmarked, the name you say quietly to yourself on an ordinary Thursday. Roman women formalized what we still quietly do. Memory, they understood, is its own form of devotion. Here is one to carry with you as we close this journey through the private and public life of Roman women. Think about where you sleep. Who is near you? What sounds surround you at night? The arrangement of rest in your life says something about safety, about intimacy, about what your culture considers normal and necessary. Sleeping arrangements in ancient Roman households were considerably more communal and layered than the modern private bedroom model we are accustomed to. Roman homes, particularly for those below the elite stratum, were compact and multi-use. In a typical middle-class Roman home, the cubiculum, the sleeping room, was small and might accommodate the couple sharing it with little extra space. Enslaved members of the household often slept in the same room as their enslaved workmates, or just outside the rooms of those they attended. For wealthier Romans, the picture changed. Married couples sometimes kept separate sleeping quarters, not as a sign of estrangement, but as a sign of status and health management. Roman medical writers advised that too much proximity at night disrupted sleep and health. A matron of means might have her own cubiculum, attended by trusted enslaved women who slept just outside or within the room itself. Children often slept with nurses or in close proximity to their caregivers rather than in isolated nurseries. The modern Western idea of sleep as a private, individual, isolated activity would have struck most Romans as both unusual and slightly dangerous. And here is the final thought for this segment, and perhaps for this entire exploration. Roman women, across all the rituals and rules and restrictions we have travelled through together, were never truly alone. They woke surrounded by others. They worked and prayed and mourned and celebrated within webs of relationship. They slept with the sounds of household life breathing around them. In their connection to each other, in the rituals they shared and the small intimacies of daily life, they built something the history books almost forgot to record. Not just a civilization, a world, warm and human and unceasingly alive, that belonged, in ways both quiet and profound, to them.